Hello. Hi, my name is Emma Franti and I work in the School of Engineering at the University of Birmingham. I'm joined here today by some of my team, well, not my team, the team, who will be presenting, and also there's other members of the team online. So if you have any questions at all, there should be somebody who can pick them up. The majority of the talk today will be on the WM Adapt project. So that's West Midlands Adapt, and WM Adapt is funded under the MACC Hub. But we're also talking a little bit about the work in the region more broadly. One of the main collaborators for WM Adapt is the West Midlands Combined Authority. And we were hoping that Bethany, the Climate Change Adaptation Manager for the Combined Authority, would be able to join us today, but unfortunately she's not able to. So I will present a little bit from the region and then we will talk about the project more generally. So next slide, please, James. So this is a slide provided by Bethany, Climate Change Adaptation Manager for the West Midlands Combined Authority. If you have any questions for Beth, we can try and take them now, or we can take them back to Beth and get back to you later. But I think the key point that Beth wanted to make with this slide is that WM Adapt is one of the things that is happening in terms of the regional adaptation plan for the West Midlands, but it's not the whole thing. And there's lots of different kind of pieces of climate adaptation that are taking part across the region. So it kind of falls into two separate strands. Firstly, there are the things that the West Midlands Combined Authority can do in terms of their internal risk management. So they're taking forth climate adaptation via their adaptation plan and monitoring and evaluation, their appraisal and enterprise risk processes. They're also making sure that the net zero and the retrofit action teams link really closely to what's happening in terms of climate adaptation. And then there's also a programme of work that's been taken forward by Transport for West Midlands that's bringing climate resilience into strategy and operations across the region. The Combined Authority then has its external adaptation action, where it can kind of advocate and link people up across the region. And so by the WM Adapt project, we have the Regional Adaptation Network that has been set up, and my colleague James will present about that shortly. We also have the Climate Risk and Vulnerability Assessment and the enhancements that we're making as part of the WM Adapt project, and Sarah will talk on behalf of the team about those after James. Then also we have the World Cafes and the rapid adaptation pathway assessments that were starting to take place across the region. These are providing a community perspective on adaptation, and the work has been delivered in partnership with BVSC, and Marianne will talk later about that. In addition to the work that's taking place for WM Adapt across the region, we also have the interdependency study. We're feeding into the LNRS, so that's the Local Nature Recovery Strategy, thinking about climate resilient nature delivery. And then there's also a programme of work that's developing adaptation indicators, because how do we know if the region is adapting to climate change? What kind of indicators can we use to measure progress? And then last but not least, I think it's probably about 18 months ago now, the West Midlands Combined Authority released a climate adaptation literacy course, which is an online course you can take to build your adaptive capacity and knowledge about climate change. So if you do have any questions on the regional adaptation for the Combined Authority, please let us know and we will try to answer. If not, we can link you up with Beth. Oh, thanks for popping the link in the chat, James. That's awesome. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide from me, and this is basically the overview of the WM Adapt project. We have 3 work streams. And the aim of the whole project is to kind of deliver that step change in adaptive capacity across the region, but also make sure that whatever we do on the project is kind of setting that there is a legacy to the project, that the things we set in place will continue after the end of the project. So work stream 1 is about creating a framework to enable place-based adaptation. It's bringing together community perspectives and thinking about how we can link those into the climate risk and vulnerability assessment, and also designing a process that can be copied or scaled or applied elsewhere. Workstream 2 is about improving and developing the climate risk and vulnerability assessment. We have mapped climate risk across the region, but there are things that we can do to tweak it, to think about how we can use it in different contexts and how we can use it for the future. And Sarah will talk about that in a moment. But Without too much further ado, I will hand over to my colleague James, who will talk to you about the work we've been doing to build regional adaptive capacity across the region and bringing together the different stakeholders who are involved in climate adaptation. So thank you very much, and over to you, James.
That's great. Thanks, Emma. So yes, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to hear our talk today. I'm James Hodgson. I'm an interdisciplinary research fellow at the University of Birmingham. So effectively, I spend my time in the schools of geography, civil engineering and public health, trying to link up all the different strands of research. And particularly in my role on WM Adapt, it's trying to sort of look at our regional adaptation network. So this isn't just myself, as Emma mentioned. Bethany Haskins-Verheesen at the Combined Authority is a real key part of the regional area network. And this is also with Nick Pyatt of Climate Sense, who are helping with a lot of our adaptive capacity assessment and building. This isn't exhaustive. A lot of the team in work streams 1 and 2 provide a lot of very helpful input and data to help inform what happens in the RAN and provide information to a lot of our stakeholders. But moving on, so what is the purpose of the WM Adapt RAN? Effectively, we're trying to connect and build relationships between the people in our region across the Combined Authority who are really sort of preparing for or being impacted now by climate change. We're trying to develop a route map for improving regional adaptive capacity. And what we mean by that is trying to work out what potential or ability organisations and people have to adapt to the future predictions of climate change. And obviously, the network at the moment is obviously UKRI and MACC funded, but we're intending to have this running past the lifespan of the project itself. So a lot of what we're trying to do is make sure that this is sustainable longer term as well, and we can keep this adaptation going so it doesn't just stop when the initial funding for the project ends as well. So initially, as we were setting up the RAN, we had, I guess, sort of this blueprint for how we'd want different people within the region to sort of be fed into it. So we have local government, so that's sort of local authorities and various teams within local authorities who we were targeting to try and bring into it. So as you can see here, we've got planners, highways, climate, public health, emergency planners, and also transport for West Midlands. Public services across a wide range, so obviously there's examples of water, energy, fire. Various environmental agencies, both, I guess, sort of main ones such as the Environment Agency or sort of voluntary groups as well. And then also voluntary care, faith and social groups were brought in as well. And then anybody else who maybe didn't fit quite as neatly into this, but for businesses and university teams as well. Those who are circled in red of that graph of yellow are actually sort of key project partners who are bringing into the work as well. But we wanted to try and make sure we were covering as many sectors and organisations as possible in who we had on the RAN, so we get the best idea of the regional capacity for adaptation. So today, I feel that we have done fairly well. So this is a snapshot of some of the organisations and companies which are signed up to the RAN, but we've got approximately 160 members across 84 different organisations and sectors. And we're constantly trying to build this up still. Obviously, I appreciate there'll be people listening and watching who aren't within the Combined Authority, but if you are part of an organisation which isn't already part of the RAN, or you have links with organisations which are within the West Midlands Combined Authority, we would obviously encourage you to get in touch and say that you'd like to be involved. The more organisations and people we have involved in this, the much better idea and more comprehensive work we'll be able to put together. But as you can see from here, we've got local councils, we've got various environment agencies, we've got housing associations, local government and other universities as well. So as I say, we're going to keep trying to build this up further as much as we can. So what do we try and do with this RAN and all of these different organisations? Well, we have approximately every couple of months, we'll have a 2-hour meeting And these are covering various topics, as you can see from, I guess, our agenda and our forward plan here. So we've sort of gone into detail of what Workstream 2 have been doing about climate risk and vulnerability assessments, looking at adaptive capacity, how community engagement and thanks Emma for dropping the link for joining the RAN, community engagement and how various groups from Workstream 1 have been able to provide their experiences and insight into local areas and how adaptation and climate change is important to them. Really forward planning on what a climate adapted West Midlands would be as well. And what we've got later this month is looking at managing interdependencies between various organisations as well. And these aren't just ourselves as a university project speaking to the members of the RAN. We will have a section when we're providing information and feedback from ourselves, but we also have a fairly large proportion of the time in the meetings from one or two of our stakeholders giving their experiences or insight into whatever the topic is that day, with breakout groups where we try and really dive down deeper into how these issues or these problems or solutions can be actioned or implemented by all of our members, really trying to get a good peer-to-peer learning experience and hopefully improving everybody's options for adaptation down the line, coming up with some new ideas and partnerships. As it also shows here, we've got an advisory group as well, which I'll come into in a little bit more detail further on. But what do we normally get from our RANs? Approximately, we're getting about 50 or more attendees across all of our organisations who are coming in. Last time we had DEFRA talking about climate resilient West Midlands and where it was coming from in the future. And as I say, we try and keep it as interactive as possible. So using things like Mentees and Miro boards. So this word cloud is everyone sort of showing what sectors they came from. And then we get feedback both from a poll, which is on the right-hand side here. As you can see, generally very positive feedback that the meetings are engaging, they're a good mix of speakers and discussion, and that people are finding the work which we're presenting and providing to them very useful. As I mentioned, we've got an advisory group for the RAN, and this is really trying to provide strategic leadership for the network. So it's made up of 9 to 12 core members, and this is something which is going to rotate slightly through the project, so we don't have just the same people on it all the time. And we try and have representation from that set of sectors which are on the screen, from academia through business, the combined authority taking the place of local government, so we don't have too much overlap between Birmingham City Council, Sandwell City Council, etc. But it's really trying to make sure that what the content we're providing within the RAN is meaningful for everybody who are members. And again, it's not ourselves as academics speaking to them and providing information that maybe isn't as wanted, let's say, or useful for them. As I say, so the responsibility of the advisory group, which we have, is to sort of define the priorities and the future meeting topics. They take turns chairing the RAN. Again, just making sure that we can try and foster those collaborative relationships between everybody on it and everybody's involved. We don't have organisations that are on the fringes. We look at where various resources and tools and future engagement opportunities can go, both in terms of our adaptive capacity work and also our events which are going out into various local authorities for public engagement. And also sort of the strategic oversight, so just making sure that our regional adaptation plan that we're working on and developing, again, is providing lots of helpful information and is relevant to the organisations that are part of the RAN. So this is something more from Nick of Climate Sense, and it's about how we assess our adaptive capacity within the region as part of the RAN. So this is something which is offered to all of our RAN members and is an ongoing recruitment process. So Climate Sense have a capacity diagnosis and development toolkit, and this is an online platform that through a series of questions and further prompts assesses how ready an organisation is to future climate predictions, and it gives an idea of how prepared they are at the moment, any sort of low-hanging fruit or unaddressed risks to their organisation based upon their current position, and it provides a cohesive step change map for future work to make sure that in some ways they aren't caught out or left behind in terms of the future climate coming up. And what this is doing is not only helping individual members of our RAN sort of maybe work out where they need to do some work and what's they need to be thinking about down the line, but on the whole is giving us a regional viewpoint on how ready the West Midlands is for future climate. Is there any very key areas which we're noticing that a specific sector or even across sectors there needs to be some more work on? And it's going to help us develop that regional adaptive plan for setting capacity targets for sectors in the entire region. And also the CAD toolkit obviously helps us pair up organisations who are maybe at very similar or just slightly different levels of preparedness, so we can have more effective peer-to-peer learning partnerships in the future as well. And as a result of our RAN membership, it's really helped us inform who to bring into the CAD assessments as a priority, and also to our rapid adaptation pathway assessments, or RAPAs, which I'll briefly touch on, but I believe we might have a bit more further on from Marianne towards the end. And it really makes sure that our work streams aren't separate, and the same for the World Cafes, the climate risk and vulnerability assessment. And it means that we have a really good dialogue between all of our work streams. They feed into the RAN feeds back to them. I think it's made sure that the work which we're providing is much more meaningful and impactful than it could have been otherwise. So I have briefly mentioned a RAP, and I appreciate this is quite a wordy slide, but effectively these are full-day workshop where we are going into a specific ward within the combined authority. So we'll be doing 7 of these. We've done 1 already. We've got 3 more in very quick succession over the next 2 or 3 weeks as well. And this is when we bring in all of the key stakeholders within the local authority. So that includes environment, local government, voluntary groups, etc. And we work through this in a workshop agenda to sort of identify the climate risks, what locations within the ward are really important, what have got the most community impact or value, let's say, and what are people's lived experience in the region. So we're looking at sort of infrastructure, water management, flooding, overheating. And it's a real starting point for very specific collaboration and management of potential risks moving forwards, and hopefully will provide both local authorities and residents, I guess, an action plan of moving forward of where they're going to go in terms of climate readiness as well. And what we actually have in these wrappers is, it's probably a little bit too small for everybody to make out the detail on this, but are big Miro boards available, which include local areas future planning. So this, I believe, is Walsall's. So it's got Walsall's 2040 plan. We've got maps of the area. We've got areas which are showing maps which are showing overheating risk, flood risk, where previous events have been found already. And this is hopefully to try and bring together information that lots of different organisations within the area will have, and it's all in one place. And all of these organisations can see where they have independencies, or they actually might be sharing data, and just hopefully provide a bit more of a bird's eye view of everything which is going on within the ward, and hopefully foster some better working relationships moving forward. I think this is also my last slide on the wrapper planning, and the wrappers aren't a isolated piece of work. So we're learning from each one. We're taking feedback from each of the stakeholders and local authorities involved in it, and taking it on to the next one to hopefully keep improving them and making it as an involved process as possible. And again, the RAN advisory group is something which is, again, feeding into these quite directly so that we can make them as helpful as possible when we're out in the field with our work. So thank you. That is everything on the RAN so far. I'm sure the other work streams will probably go into a bit more detail, maybe on World Cafes and wrappers. But if there's any burning questions right now, please feel free to shout out. And if not, I will pass over to the next one in the team to present.
Thanks, James. It was a really clear introduction and overview to the project and also the work that we're doing as part of the Regional Adaptation Network. I popped a couple of questions in the chat, but if anyone else has any questions, they should feel free to put them into the Q&A box, because I can ask James questions anytime. But a couple of things that I was just thinking as you were presenting, James, is there any sectors that we'd really like to have in the Regional Adaptation Network that we've not managed to engage with yet?
I feel like we've had pretty good involvement from a lot of organisations. Nobody who we've gone to has actively sort of not been involved. I feel like we probably could maybe bring in a tiny bit more from, I guess, maybe volunteer groups or maybe more faith groups within the region. We obviously had, I guess Marianne could speak more to this, a lot of good engagement from the World Cafes along that side of thing, but active, or I guess, sort of membership within the RAN has been a lot more, I guess, maybe into, for want of a better word, mainstream organisations than voluntary groups, maybe.
Thanks, James. And I was also wondering about the CAD process. If you're not familiar with it, it's like this online platform and there's lots and lots of different questions, isn't there, James? And I was wondering, how did our RAN members find it? Because we find the information tremendously useful, but did they find going through that process helpful for them?
Yeah, so as part of the process, everybody who goes through Climate Sense's CAD toolkit gets, as I said, a full report on where their current adaptive capacity is and where they've got strengths and weaknesses and how they can address those. But there's also additional follow-up meetings with Nick and the team at Climate Sense to really talk this through, to make sure that those organisations are recognising these strengths and weaknesses that have been highlighted. And I think a lot of the time it's been very positive that they've either sort of had not necessarily key holes in their adaptation plan pointed out, but they've had sort of clear direction of where they maybe need to go next, which has been positive. And to Claudia's the question about the cost of the tool. So everybody who's part of the RAN network or on the project has got free access into Climate Sense, but this is normally a paid service. But yeah, everybody who's part of the RAN network and part of the project is going through this with CAD as part of that cost.
Thanks for taking that question, James. And I think we'll try and put a little bit more information about CAD into the chat, and then you can find out about it yourself. And if you are based in the West Midlands and you really want to do if you really want to go on the CAD platform, then just get in touch or join the Regional Adaptation Network. This is one of the purposes of the seminar. So thanks ever so much, James. Sarah, are you ready to take over?
Yes, I think I've taken control of the screen. So has the slide changed? Fabulous. Thanks very much, Emma. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Sarah Greenham. I'm a research fellow in civil engineering at the University of Birmingham. And I'm here representing our wider team in the work stream that, as we like to kind of call it, the climate data jigsaw. So pulling together lots of different data. I'm going to be speaking very much to climate risk and vulnerability, which I will assessment, which I will call CRVA as we talk through this. So firstly, to acknowledge the team, we've got a wonderful team at the university and beyond that are developing all the models that are going into updating the data that goes into the current CRVA, building on existing work that we have done on previous projects. So the CRVA does already exist in some form at the Combined Authority, and we are working on WM Adapt to enhance this data as best as we can, because we found some opportunities to address that. So just want to make a shout out to the team here. Some of them are also online. And as I probably not be able to answer any of the technical questions in some of their remit, I may call on you if you are there. You're very welcome to raise your hand and respond on behalf of the team. So thank you for that. So to start with, a little bit on the background of what the CRVA is and the methodology that we've taken. So as I mentioned, these maps that already exist from stemming from previous projects. We had done, and this is a good procedure that any sort of mapping would undertake, collecting lots of different data that represents climate hazards, socioeconomic vulnerability, and the population or whatever the context of your infrastructure perhaps, or your exposure to the climate hazard may be, finding that data and pulling it all together and finding a way to harmonize that data, standardize that data and score it to create a combined final layer that represents the overarching climate risk and vulnerability for an area. So this is all very geospatially focused work. And then once that's all brought together and co-developed with stakeholders, that map can get published. We have this already available through the Combined Authority on their website. So if you were to Google it, you would probably be able to find it quite quickly. If you put the WMCA CRVA, it should come up top. And then as part of pulling all of this together, it is then to stimulate adaptation engagement and identify hotspots and anywhere that you would maybe consider where resources and effort and finance would potentially be prioritized or focused, particularly when we are looking at a very resource constrained environment that we sit in with adaptation. And what's really important with this is that this is an iterative cycle and that this data is updated or new methodologies are updated, that we revisit this, and this is part of adaptation as a cycle is a good philosophy to consider. So I would say that WM Adapt is sort of the second cycle of having done this. We've done this once. We're now working into parts 1 and 2 of updating the data through modeling and refining the data into more high resolution where we can with more accuracy, and then finding the methods to better combine it again to republish for the Combined Authority. So workstream 2, which is what I'm here to represent, we are looking at developing a deliverable on an open access approach to CRVA forecasting. Very much everything that we've done today is present day. So what we're really focusing on in WM Adapt is how we can start looking into modeling and then forecasting for future scenario planning. And therefore, that means decision makers have a decision-centric science to help with their evidence-based adaptation and decision-making needs. So I'm going to be talking about 4 different aspects of the task. So we have modelling on future urban heat islands and current urban heat islands, future and current pluvial surface water flood risk, developing some of that into health burden layers, and then a test to see if we can develop an economic impact at a spatial level. And within the project, which I'm not going to talk about yet because we are coming to this later down the line, is how we integrate all of this into existing climate risk and vulnerability tools, and then integrate it into the platform that the Combined Authority have. So I'm going to start with discussing what we're progressing for the urban heat island modelling. So there are several inputs into the model to develop the urban heat island model at a high resolution. These grids are the domain of the West Midlands area that we've selected for analysis. So we are looking at different variables reflective of land use. So that's the ability to absorb and release heat from the surface wetness, and surface reflectivity. Then we pull in data from the urban canopy. So that's building volume and the surface roughness, and then also elevation and terrain data. And then coupled with meteorology data, these are then all combined to create the model outputs, and the setup for all of our mapping is at 100-meter grid resolution. It's quite high resolution, and at a regional scale, it gives us quite a detailed overview of the area. And there are several different ways we can compile the data. So we will be, the model produces full temperature maps for the whole of the region. We can slice and dice it by time period. We can look at specific hours, and we can also aggregate that data. So that's where the baseline model is currently being reviewed. And the evaluation of that model is being utilized with existing land surface temperature data from remote sensing and satellite information, So that's what you can see on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is an example of where we've been evaluating the model just at the Birmingham area before we expand it to the wider West Midlands region. So looking at that sort of spatially, but then also looking at that temporally, we are taking records, long-term records, and then comparing it to the model at specific sites to just validate the accuracy of our model, which seems to be looking quite good. And then that will create the baseline model that we will produce that will go into the CRVA. And then we're looking at investigating how we can develop future scenarios around perhaps 2050 or 2030s and 2040s. And these modelling scenarios are going to also consider not only future climate change projections, but also some of the proposed land use change in the area. So the development, changing green space, and we will model them in different ways to see what the impact would have. And particularly for urban heat, that would also include anthropogenic heating in the winter. So some of the things that we're doing at the moment is what we can do with these models is a huge range of things that we're going to work on how we decide what to actually incorporate into the CRVA. But the model is being really valuable at producing lots of other outputs that we're feeding into different parts of the project. So this is an example of sort of a monthly average of the model at the West Midlands, the whole region. We can also provide hourly specific data. So for a particular hour on a particular day for the whole region, we can then average it to long-term averages like a month. And also we can pull this data and do post-processing for other needs. So one thing that's been really helpful for the health team is understanding the sort of the temperature threshold, so the number of days exceeding a certain temperature. The model is able to pull that all together and we can produce those sorts of outputs and then aggregate them to administrative boundaries such as lower super output area. And if we were to also incorporate thermal humidity and wind speed, we can then produce thermal comfort parameters, for example. So what we've been able to do is really make a step change in what current temperature data sits in the CRVA to really enhance it and increase our accuracy of our impacts on climate change. So these are some examples of what the maps can do if we've got them at an average maximum or a mean for a particular day. So this was an LSOA. These are two maps at LSOA level for a heat wave day. So we can really see the difference of the different climate variables. And as James had already mentioned about wrappers, we've also used the modelling to produce neighbourhood and quite sort of detailed scale resolution maps that trigger conversations and discussions in the wrappers at neighbourhood level. And we've also incorporated that in the context of the underlying map, so you can see where the green space is and what area, what attributes of the land might be impacting the overall temperature. That really stimulates discussion. So now moving on to the pluvial flood risk modelling. So this is really underpinned by utilising a flood event that really hit the West Midlands quite badly in September 2024. And the data that we've been able to use from that has allowed us to really make a step change in the surface flood risk modelling. So the setup of the model using digital elevation model, land use, rainfall data, and a hydrodynamic model developed by our colleagues at the university. And we can produce a range of variables that represent the surface water flood risk overall. That has been modelled here and reconstructed and then tested with comparisons. So just to show you the sort of scale of the resolution we're looking at here, I think it's 5 to 10 metres, looking at flood depth, velocity, inundation, and how long ponding the flood sort of stays put. So in reconstructing this flood event, we've been able to prepare the workflow to develop the flood maps. And in the validation of that model, that has been done by comparing the simulations with news reports. So the team have pulled lots of news information and compared photos and identifying where the flood has modelled, whether that's actually been reflected in what's been reported. And the simulations have shown good agreement with a lot of the observations, and a final validation check with the Environment Agency flood maps have shown good consistency with our model to the Environment Agency's model. What's really novel about the work that's being developed is that this model is producing spatio-temporal events out of return periods. So it's really changing the way that we interpret the maps, and that's what's going to be important for inputting into the CRVA. And just for context here, using, I don't know if these are going to run, I think they're quite heavy. They're not running on my screen, but they show a movement of rainfall across the area. So this grid is also the domain of the West Midlands. And in doing this, it's a novel method of constructing spatio-temporal rainfall scenarios using return periods and also drainage climate uplifts. So this is sort of a new additional information to enhance the existing flood models that do exist. And what we're doing with those model outputs is then incorporating them into flood risk layers for the CRVA. So we've been able to develop, using several runs of the model, a baseline scenario of the areas most susceptible to surface water flood risk, and then looking at future scenarios. And I think in the figure B in the middle on the right-hand side is showing the increase in exposure or risk to fluvial flood risk later in the future. So these are going to be maps that we can then start incorporating into our CRVA, which is something we've not been able to do yet at this point. Then moving on to health burden modelling, this is quite exciting. So some of you that may be aware of the Climate Health Explorer tool that has been developed by the university is it cuts across multiple projects that we have. There was the launch of the Climate Health Explorer last week, if you were interested. So this is evidence-based policy decision making tool that promotes a whole system approach to climate policy and is also ultimately focused on increasing climate change and health awareness. So firstly, if you're interested, please do have a look at the Climate Health Explorer tool, and you can see what's been done for other projects, which this is now feeding into WM Adapt as well. So the framework is here. This is incorporating other projects, which is I've got here is Inhabit, Complete, and there's also WM Net Zero, which is our sister project. The Climate Health Explorer is developing multiple different current and future scenarios, looking at the exposure pathways of the health determinants and outcomes of the climate variables. And we are incorporating here with WM Adapt and adaptation, the exposure pathways of heat and cold exposure, and also the risk of fluvial flooding, and how using literature to really understand what the health and economic outcomes of the changes in the climate are having on public health. And this is something that also has not been considered before in our CRVA, and is going to be something that really gives us a step change in our understanding of how climate is really affecting our population. And these are some example outputs that have been developed for the Climate Health Explorer on other projects. So, for example, here we've got road traffic noise, and then having carried this out, it's able to determine that 1 in 4 people across the West Midlands experience harmful road noise, which is, I think, exceeding the World Health Organization guidelines. For WM Adapt, so this is work in progress and will be announced in an update to the tool later in this year. But this is the WM Net Zero interface from a sister project released last week. The plan is that we will be using a very similar approach to look at mortality from extreme heat and cold and investigate the effects on fluvial flood risk as well from a health perspective. So basically, to watch this space, this data will be coming, and you'll be able to have a play and access it open through the Climate Health Explorer for the West Midlands. And then finally, moving into economic modelling, this is something that hasn't really been done before. There's an awful lot of macroeconomic analysis that's been undertaken for the West Midlands, and this is sort of going to be a proxy assessment to understand, can we really identify the financial burden at a spatial extent across the region. So what we're looking at the moment is in taking a first estimate of the spatial distribution, looking at, this is a snapshot of a part of Birmingham, really trying to understand the detail of the different land use types, categorizing by functional land use, then trying to identify industry sector sites and their density as an exposure metric, looking into any literature that identifies estimated damage per business type, industry or sector, and determining the economic sensitivity from this information and the adaptive capacity in financial terms, so gross value added. And then in formulating that calculation, identifying the density of the different business sector types and the distribution across the region, that we can then identify what is potential financial distribution and impact and cost of climate change. And that would be utilising the urban heat modelling and the flood risk modelling for past and future. And then putting this all together into what we're really looking at for the next steps for all of this modelling. is future scenario models and then integrating the CRBA data that we produce into the platform for the combined authority. What's really important for us at the moment is, while I've presented a lot of establishing our models, once we have these all ironed out and validated, we are then discussing as a group the time horizons and the emission scenarios that will be confirmed as we come to a collective agreement on a future scenario for different CRBA environments. This is something we have control of with the data. And similarly, the other thing we have control of with the data is adjusting the land use type. So we're also working with colleagues to understand using local authority plans and looking at development plans that are site specific across the region. And I've mentioned, I think Emma mentioned, the local nature recovery strategy, all the indications across the literature and across the publications for the combined authority that we can make adjustments to space and development sites, and whether there's more green space or less green space, and they will all get incorporated back into the urban heat island modelling and the pluvial flood risk modelling. And then that will feed into the health burden and economic layers. And all of these layers will then be able to provide updates to our existing CRBA. And what's really powerful with doing that is that we can then really start to monitor and evaluate the current and future developments and any decisions that are made as more data comes in. And we begin the cycle again, and we start looking at more data and then updating the CRBA accordingly. And therefore, we start having snapshots in time of how the CRBA is changing. And that is a really valuable, quantifiable monitoring and evaluation piece that we really hope that this project is able to deliver. I'm hoping I've comprehensively covered everything on behalf of the team, and thank you for those that have joined in today. I think I will stop there and take any burning questions, and if need be, I can pass over to one of my team. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a lot of science to get through, and you did so ever so concisely and succinctly. So thank you very much. There is a question in the chat related to how does the CRVA compare in terms of detail and quality to national scale tools such as Climate Just. I think this is one to circle back to at the end of the discussion, and then it gives you a little bit of time to perhaps play with the Climate Just model, which I've just been doing myself. But it's a really good question, Nathan, and thank you very much for asking it. Yeah, I think that's a good one for a discussion. There's also something in the chat. Yes, we're really happy to share our slides, aren't we, Sarah? Especially the one with the simulation that didn't quite load properly as well.
That's great. Yeah, I think that in terms of how it compares, one thing I did fail to mention, but I think I must emphasize, which maybe would be a factor, is the way that we have scored the risk when we bring it all together is relative in the context of the boundary of the West Midlands. So what is considered, if we were to put high risk to an area or very high risk to an area, it is relative to that boundary. So it may be that in sort of analytical terms, it's not like for like but comparable, but I'm sure we'd be able to have a look at it. It'd be very interesting to see.
Okay, so if anybody does have any more questions for Sarah, please put them in the Q&A box. Otherwise, I will just keep asking questions. And what we'd really like to know what you want to ask us. So if you do have any more questions, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll pick them up at the end. And I think we'll also have a longer discussion about the Climate Just maps and also perhaps other CRVAs that we know about. For example, there is one for the Greater London Authority as well. So let's move on to Marianne. Thank you ever so much, Sarah.
Thank you.
How are you doing with your slides, Marianne?
I'm hoping that I've got them. Can everybody see that?
Brilliant.
Yeah, perfect. So hi everybody, I'm Marianne Walker. I'm from Birmingham Voluntary Service Council research team, and we've been working on the World Cafe element of the project. I'll be presenting a quick overview of what we did and some preliminary findings. So first of all, just some acknowledgements. So this part of the project has been a collaboration between the University of Birmingham and BVSC Research. From BVSC, my colleague Kesh has been working on the project, and she was absolutely instrumental in kind of setting this up. From the University of Birmingham, we have Professor Jessica Pikett and Dr. Hallie Healy, who've led on this part of the project. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it today. But, just to acknowledge their part in this. So between May and November 2025, we held a series of what we called Wild Weather World Cafes across 16 different wards in 7 local authority areas across the West Midlands. We used a community research approach here, and this means that local community researchers, so people from these wards, played a central role in designing, facilitating and analysing the kind of the research and the conversations. This was really instrumental in helping us reach people whose voices are often underrepresented in climate discussions, and it also really helped ensure that findings were grounded in lived experience. In total, we heard from 285 residents, many from communities that are more likely to experience the impacts of extreme weather, but are less likely to be involved in decision-making processes. Through a series of facilitated table discussions, we explored people's experiences of extreme weather, things like heat waves, flooding and severe storms, and how these events affected their daily lives, and also the way that different actors responded in the local community. Another purpose of these events was to kind of discuss attitudes towards climate adaptation, so the barriers and the enablers that shape people's ability to adapt, and what people value most in their communities, so the kind of things they want to protect from climate change. The findings I'll be sharing today bring together these conversations and highlight what residents told us. So first of all, before I go into the findings, I just wanted to share what's been going on since we completed the World Cafes. So firstly, we completed a thematic analysis of the conversations across all the wards, where we identified common experiences, concerns and priorities relating to climate adaptation. We use this to then produce ward level reports in all 16 of the wards, and I'm hoping this QR code works on the screen if you're interested. Scan that and that will take you to a page where you can download any of the ward level reports. We're also currently working on developing a synthesis report, which brings together findings from across all the locations to identify those kind of wider regional themes and recommendations. An important part of this process has been ongoing collaboration with our community researchers. So we've been holding sense checking sessions with them. We did one a couple of weeks ago. That kind of brings together all the conversations to sense check the thematic analysis and help us identify the messages that they felt were most important for decision makers to hear. We're also in the progress of, and I'm hoping this will be finished today, developing a climate conversations handbook, which will capture kind of the approach we use, the methods, the lessons learned and practical guidance from the project, with the aim of enabling other community organisations or other groups to run a similar models if they wanted to. If anyone wants any more details about that, I'll put my email in the chat afterwards and I can send you a copy. So now on to the findings. So in terms of extreme weather experiences, one of the key findings was that experience of extreme weather is not a problem that's in the future. Instead, it's something that participants were already experiencing. It's something that's people are experiencing through everyday life, not just environmental change on its own. So participants rarely spoke about climate change in kind of abstract terms. Instead, they described disrupted routines, things like difficulty travelling, struggling to sleep, missing work or appointments, and reduced access to community spaces and infrastructure. Extreme weather was also seen to create interconnected impacts. So experiences extended beyond the weather event itself, affecting physical health, mental well-being, mobility, social connections, and financial security. And weather events were seen as often triggering wider social and economic consequences. It was also seen that existing inequalities shaped climate vulnerability. So this was something that was seen across all weather types. Participants consistently identified older people, disabled people, those with long-term health conditions, low-income houses and children as being the most affected. And it was noted that extreme weather was seen as often amplifying existing disadvantages. One of the key issues that emerged was housing as a climate issue. So whether it was discussing heat waves, flooding, storms or extreme cold, conversations repeatedly returned to housing quality. Things like damp, mould, overheating, poor insulation, housing disrepair, rising energy costs. These were all seen as major factors that shape people's experience of extreme weather. So to sum this kind of section up, overall participants really described extreme weather not simply as an environmental issue, but as a social issue that intersects with housing, health, inequality and everyday life. One of the other exercises we did during the World Cafes was looking at responses to extreme weather. So we're asking participants to reflect on the role of a wide range of actors, including local authorities, emergency services, utility providers, schools, community organisations, faith groups, local residents, whatever actors they could think of, essentially. And the discussion highlighted the kind of critical role of local support networks, while raising questions about preparedness, communication, and the ability of existing systems to meet growing climate challenges. So a key finding here was that support came from both formal services and informal community networks. Many participants we spoke with described how neighbours and local organisations were essential sources of practical and emotional support during extreme weather, and this was something across all wards. Across the discussions, people also noted that emergency and frontline services were generally praised for their responses, but there was also recognition that these services are operating under increasing pressure. In contrast to this, participants also noted they often felt that organisations responsible for infrastructure and public services were responding to problems after they occurred, so a more of reactive rather than proactive approach. Another key finding here was that communication. This was a recurring theme again across all World Cafes we did, with participants highlighting that there needs to be an improvement in timely, accessible and trusted information before and during extreme weather events. They also highlighted in this regard that access to support and kind of information wasn't experienced equally. So there were lots of discussions about language barriers, digital exclusion and varying levels of awareness, and this was seen as really affecting people's ability to access help. So overall, when we're talking about the responses to extreme weather, the findings from the World Cafe revealed that both the importance of local support networks and also wider concerns about preparedness, communication and the capacity of systems. The third kind of World Cafe we did, which is a third exercise we did with each of the World Cafes, participants discussed adaptation and kind of visions for visions for adaptation. So when participants discussed adaptation, they weren't simply talking about individual projects or technologies. Instead, they described broader visions for how communities could become more resilient to extreme weather. So across the region, there was a strong emphasis on protecting people and reducing inequalities. Participants consistently argued that our adaptation efforts to prioritise those most vulnerable to extreme weather, including older people, children, disabled people and those facing financial hardship. They also highlighted the importance of strengthening communities and local capacity. Many of the participants we spoke with favoured those kind of community-led and locally owned approaches, arguing that local people have valuable knowledge and should play an active role in shaping adaptation within their neighbourhoods. But at the same time, participants were clear that adaptation could not rely on communities alone. They emphasised the need for investment in resilient homes, services and infrastructure alongside those kind of more proactive measures of like maintenance and long-term planning. A recurring theme here was importance of institutional leadership and accountability. So participants felt that local authorities, landlords and utility providers should fulfil their responsibilities and take a leading role in supporting adaptation. Funding was also something that was viewed as really critical. Across all the wards, there was a strong view that adaptation should be supported through public investment, grants, other forms of assistance, rather than placing the financial burden solely on residents. Participants also highlighted the importance of accessible information, early warning systems and opportunities for learning. One of the areas that was discussed quite frequently was schools, and these were viewed as important places for building knowledge and preparing future generations for climate risks. So to sum this up, overall, participants envisaged climate change as a shared responsibility that combined both community action with long-term institutional support, while placing the kind of equity and the needs of vulnerable residents at its centre. So after the World Cafe, and I think this was 2 weeks ago now, we held a sense checking session with the community research. There were 16 community researchers who attended all the kind of World Cafes over the last year. And the aim of this sense checking session was to bring everybody together, draw on what they'd heard across the multiple communities they worked with to collectively identify what they felt were the most important messages for decision makers to hear. So while there were many specific ideas and recommendations discussed throughout the project, 4 priority areas consistently emerged. So the first was leadership, with community researchers highlighting the need for clearer coordination, accountability and visible leadership on climate adaptation. The second was communication and education, particularly around those kind of early warning systems, accessible information and opportunities for communities to build knowledge and skills. The third was infrastructure, including investment in housing, transport, energy systems and green infrastructure to better prepare communities for future extreme weather. And finally, community researchers emphasise the importance of community-led action, arguing that communities should be supported and resourced to play an active role in adaptation, rather than simply being recipients of top-down interventions. And then perhaps most importantly, community researchers also felt there was a need to strike a balance between responding to immediate extreme weather events and investing in the longer term planning, that kind of maintenance, education and community capacity that's needed to build resilience over time. So together, these priorities represent a community-led set of measures that for decision makers about what is needed for climate adaptation across the West Midlands. And the image we've got here is we had a kind of live illustrator at one of the sense checking events who captured these findings. So the next steps, as I mentioned, we're currently finalising the regional synthesis report that should be available soon, which brings together all the findings. And as James mentioned earlier, the findings are also feeding directly into a series of wrappers, regional adaptation plan and action. I'm hoping I've got that right. These workshops will bring together kind of local stakeholders and residents to develop neighbourhood-based adaptation plans informed by community priorities. Hallie, my colleague in the University of Birmingham, is also using this model and trialling it in Enfield, London, so running World Cafes there. And this will help us understand how the method can be adapted to different local contexts while maintaining its community-led principles. So I rushed through that quite quickly, but if anyone has any questions, very happy to answer them. Thank you, Kate. Nearly got it right.
Thanks ever so much, Marianne, and thank you very much for presenting what was a huge programme of work across the region. I don't think it should be underestimated the amount of work it took to train a community of researchers to deliver 16 different world cafes in 16 different community hubs, recruiting people on the ground. I think you were out with flyers in shops, speaking to people.
Yeah, to reach people in each of the communities, we use a kind of lots of different approaches. So going through local Facebook groups, community reaches on the ground, in charity shops, walking down the high street, kind of getting people to recruit, because I think we really wanted people to be in the room who weren't people who were necessarily well versed in kind of climate change, or if that makes sense, getting that kind of widespread of people who aren't usually involved in these kind of conversations. So yeah.
Did you come across any kind of climate skepticism or
no, that was
negative,
like
negative thoughts towards what we were trying to do?
One of the things we did find a lot is at the beginning of World Cafes, people would turn up and think they had nothing to add to the conversation, that climate change hadn't affected them and stuff. But when they sat and unpacked it, there was that kind of realization about how this is everyday life, things that have been just internalized, that this is the way life is, everyday life is like this now, and making those kind of connections. But no kind of skeptics. No, but that was something I was worried about happening. But no, didn't happen.
Thanks ever so much, Marianne. It's interesting how a part of like daily life it has become. We ran we did like a community a family world cafe type thing during half term at May, during the May heat wave, and we were talking to all the different kids, and some of them had been sleeping downstairs. They were drinking lots of water because the homes that they were living in were just too hot, like my house, and we all slept downstairs that week because it was too hot to sleep upstairs. So I think what we can do now is we have around half an hour. We don't need to use half an hour of everybody's time. You're not going to be forced to be kept in this webinar if you don't want to be here, but it is an opportunity for you to ask any of the researchers here, so not just the team who presented, but also the rest of the team on the call, anything that you want to about any of the work that we've presented, or perhaps tell us a little bit about how you're working in the region. So I noticed, was it Kat who mentioned that you were doing something similar? I've forgotten where. Something similar somewhere else. That's rubbish. Brighton and Hove. So I don't know if it's possible, or you'd like to talk a little bit about that, Kat, or is that possible, Jen? Via the. Can I unmute you, Kat? I wonder. Hello, Mike. Okay. Hi, Kat. Okay. I don't know if we can unmute people or not.
Oh, can I unmute at my end? Yes.
Oh, amazing.
Sorry, Emma. I could have done that to start with. No, I was just
It's
saying,
okay.
so
You're the first and you're the bravest, and I put you on the spot. So thank you for speaking. Your camera's off, but that's fine. Whatever works for you.
No, I think that's still blocked.
Okay.
But yeah, I just want to say it's great to hear like Marianne's work and really engaging people in those conversations. What we're doing in Brighton and Hove has been sort of one step back from that, really, just trying to really engage communities that have been excluded from these conversations for too long. And we haven't gone as far yet as really digging into resilience, and we didn't start from that, extreme weather event. But again, those such similar themes emerging about power and agency and people, the balance between where responsibility lies for change. Yeah, so that's what we're, and of course people's ideas and what people are doing, and when people connect, making that connection between climate change and what's happening around them, and then actions that they're already taking, which are part of solutions. So when people realize that actually they're not part of the problem but part of the solution, that's flip from being being disempowered to an active contributor. So yeah, really interested to see the climate conversations piece and see whether we might be able to draw on that as we move forward into the next phase. So yeah, great to hear what you're doing. Thank you.
You're on mute, Marianne.
Sorry. I'll put my email address in the chat, and if anybody wants a copy of this handbook, I can send you it. But yeah, great to hear you're doing similar things in Brighton. I'd be really interested to hear about your findings.
Thanks, Marianne. And just to mention, one of the key things that we wanted to do on WM Adapt was not just do stuff for the West Midlands, but try and provide resources for other people that may want to follow the same method or adapt the method that we're using for their local area. And so we've put the method for the climate risk and vulnerability assessment in the chat, and Marianne, you can also or one of us can put the links through for the outputs of the wild weather cafes, and also for the handbook. There's a handbook forthcoming, isn't there? There's one question I'm going to deal with right away, and it's from Louis, and it's about adaptation metrics. And can you give me a short update on the work being done to establish adaptation metrics? I'm really sorry, but the answer is no. That's something that Bethany is doing and leading, and we haven't had much involvement in. And unfortunately, Bethany's not here today. But what I can do is, if you're happy to pop your email address into the chat, or perhaps if I'm able to access it after the meeting, what I can do is link you up with Bethany, and then she can tell you a little bit more about what the Combined Authority are doing on that. Bridie has asked us a really interesting question about, are there any elements of this work you would like to expand on or develop in new directions in the future? And I thought that was a really interesting question that we could come on to, perhaps after we've looped back to the question from Nathan on Climate Just. So I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to say, Sarah, about the Climate Just approach and how it compares to the CRVA, or I can pick that up first and then you can have a go.
Please go ahead.
Are you sure?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
So the Climate Just map is really nice. It's got lots of familiar GIS friends behind the development of it. I really liked it. And what the Climate Just map, I think, as far as I understand, is it shows you how vulnerable a particular population is to climate change. And it shows you a little bit about why they're vulnerable to flooding and to overheating risk. So that's really interesting, and it's useful in itself. In terms of how that differs to the climate risk and vulnerability assessment, the CRVA, it's broken down into the climate risk so that we can show you what the flood risk looks like, what the overheating risk looks like. We can then show you the exposure, and then we can then show you the vulnerability. And so we break these things down into the different component parts. And that's been really useful because one of the things I can't remember if Sarah mentioned is the ultimate plan of the CRVA is not that it sits with us as the university, is that it sits within the West Midlands Combined Authority. So they hold the data sets, they update it, and that allows them to continue using it to inform business decisions moving forward. We did something similar for Birmingham City Council, and so they have a climate risk and vulnerability assessment. It's handled by the GIS teams, and the way they've been using it in Birmingham is they've been using it as part of the green infrastructure planning for East Birmingham. And so what they can do within the planning process is they can look at the climate drivers, the flood risk, the overheating risk, and the vulnerability, and then the local nature recovery strategy, and then the existing green infrastructure, and they can kind of use these to drive planning decisions forward. So that's why it's useful to be able to have this kind of one number that you get out of the CRVA process, but also why it's useful to kind of break it down into its different components. The other advantage is of the CRVA in terms of it being kind of a dynamic model is that we can model future scenarios. So Sarah, I don't know if you want to say anything about the work that's been done for kind of 2050 or about how you've been going through, or maybe James wants to comment on this, how you've been going through local authority plans to kind of pick out the green infrastructure, and that will help us understand not just how the climate is changing, but also how the West Midlands is changing in terms of its urban form.
Thanks, Emma. I think, yeah, the two main factors is because they're looking at a regional level, the modelling goes far more high resolution. So we're able to really hone in at the neighbourhood scale of the sort of climate justice, I guess, because we do incorporate a lot of similar data sets. And yes, I'm happy to hand over to James as well about the incorporation of the land use change data. We are utilising the models so that because of the development of our methodology and our modelling and the incorporation of the climate projections, we are able to feed these into the model to develop a high resolution to complement the high resolution at the regional scale that we're developing. And then with the land use change, that is also another factor, really looking at the development side of things. I don't know, James, if you wanted to pick up on anything that you've managed with, because James has been leading on pulling all the qualitative data from the reports into some quantitative mapping that will support the modelling. I don't know if you have anything on your experience with that so far.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so we're working with sort of a base map for the current land use and green infrastructure of the region. So we've brought together, I think, sort of probably 3 or 4 different data layers to produce a base map of the current land use and infrastructure of the West Midlands. And then, yeah, so as Sarah says, I'm in the process of, I guess, looking at the Combined Authorities 2040 development plan and also local authorities development plans and seeing where, in theory, there's going to be additional urbanisation, if there's areas which are highlighted for being protected green space or green space development options, and we're going to bring that together into a forward plan GIS map, which then will hopefully provide better insight for the flooding and the overheating teams for those future predictions. So it's a little bit, I guess, sort of guesswork, because obviously as much as we can hope, there's no guarantee that maybe local authorities will definitely follow the plans which are in place, but it's the best guess of what we can do for those future land use changes.
Thanks, James. I guess, yeah, and also to emphasise as well that in incorporating some different ways that we would change the land use in our model and also the different projections, we can then provide quite a dynamic suite of potential future pathways that also support the combined authority in their decision making now for the sort of medium and longer term.
Thanks, Sarah. So we've touched a little bit on how we're taking forward sort of the work stream 2, the climate science jigsaw element of the project. I think in terms of what we would like to do with the regional adaptation network, one of the key things is kind of making that a network that works. So thinking about what's useful for the people for those stakeholders who are involved in the network. And for that reason, we've set up a steering committee. Is that right, James, for the RAN? And we're thinking about what the RAN can do, not as part of WM Adapt, what the RAN can do because it exists as a consequence of WM Adapt. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, James.
Yeah, I think with the RAN, it's really trying to see what it's a real two-way conversation, isn't it, really, between sort of what the research that we're doing or what was initially set out as the project's aims and goals. But we really don't want it to be just an academic conversation. We want it to be as much information and feedback from the members of the RAN and what sort of the World Cafes have shown us, and we're then getting additional feedback from all of the rapper events, the one we've held so far and the ones which are coming up. And we're getting quite detailed lived experience feedback from residents and organisations in those wards that we're going into. And then that's sort of being fed back into, I guess, sort of the CRVA work as well, to hopefully make sure that what we're predicting and what we're modelling is matching up, which is what is actually happening on the ground.
Thanks, James. I also think there's an opportunity to create some sort of regional impact database, because we don't really know how climate change impacts us as a region. There's lots of kind of disparate data sets. You know, we know how often the fire service get called out. We know how often the police might get called out. We know how infrastructure might be impacted. We know what people are telling us from the wild weather cafes. And you know, I wonder how this can all be pulled forward into some sort of regional impact database. The other thing I wanted to think about a little bit more, and Kate, I know Kate's on the call as well, Kate Lonsdale, is the work that we've just started now with the wrappers, which I'm just going to check in the chat to make sure I get all my letters in the right order, but it's the rapid adaptation pathway assessments. So these are really important things for bringing people together to talk about how climate change might impact a community. And so the way we've been developing these within the region is we've been taking the findings from the reports from the original World Cafes, and then we've been bringing together multiple different agencies across the region who are kind of responsible in some way for what is happening within that ward. So it could be the local authority, it could be the lead local flood agency, it could be community groups working in the ward. And we brought these people together into a multi-agency workshop to try and talk about how climate adaptation is impacting that community and how we can take it forward. So I think first off, it's a tremendous amount of people to bring together. And so I think Bethany and Marianne and the team have done and James have done a great job in getting together the stakeholders into that conversation. But then Climate Sense, who are steering these conversations, then have this really exciting but complex job of holding a conversation that works between all these different people in like a 4-hour time period in somewhere in the West Midlands. I don't know if you want to add anything, Kate, and whether you can unmute or whether I have to do something fancy to let you talk. Maybe you can unmute.
Hi, yes, thanks, Emma.
Okay.
Yes, so we've got 3, as I think James mentioned, we've got 3 coming up quite soon. So we've had 1. We're doing some rapid learning from that to try and make the next ones as effective as possible, because there's a lot of information that's already out there that we're trying to, and lots of different types of expertise that need to come together in a relatively short space of time, even though we're, you know, they're taking best part of a day. So it's quite challenging, but really interesting to see what variations we're going to get across the West Midlands. Yeah, anything specific I should talk about, or?
No, that's just great. I mean, Kate, you're the you know, you're steering the big ship with Nick, so I just wanted to give you a chance to talk. And yeah. I guess if anybody has any specific questions, they could pop those into the chat, and we could pick them up in a moment. But thanks, Kate. Is there anything that that James or Marianne or Sarah wanted to add on about the wrappers? We did have one in Willenhall, and we've got one next week, I think, and then one the week after. So they're very much in progress.
Yeah, definitely. I think, especially from the first one, it was incredibly informative, and I think a lot of positive feedback from the people who were invited to it. obviously there were people or organisations that do already work together or have good relationships between employees. But I think maybe getting that number of key stakeholders together in the same room at the same time, even if they're working on slightly different aspects of, or they've got slightly different remits of climate adaptation, I think that's a really novel thing which we have with the wrapper events. And I think hopefully is the start of fostering the opportunity for much more wide cross-organisation discussions and planning, which maybe they wouldn't have the opportunity for before. So I think it's probably another positive outcome from the wrappers that maybe wasn't explicitly within, I guess, the plans of holding them, but hopefully will be quite beneficial moving forward even after the wrapper events.
Thanks, James. I have to provide an update to our funder, so I will include that unexpected benefit of project research in that report. Okay, so I think we'll move on to another question from Gabriel. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, so sorry if I've just mispronounced your name. But do you see climate risk and vulnerability? Do you see us extending into agricultural risks and nature-based adaptation measures at a catchment scale? This is a really, really interesting point because we don't tend to think about agriculture much in the West Midlands because it is a really urbanised region. But if I was thinking, for example, how perhaps I'd do this in North Lancashire or Cumbria, where I grew up, then, you know, you'd be preparing a totally different kind of climate risk assessment. I don't know if you have any ideas on that, Sarah, or any thoughts?
It's a really great question. I've been thinking about it for a while and I saw it appear in the Q&A. So I have recently been exploring the economic layer and I did detect some agricultural related industry. So I anticipate that we could pick that up in our methodology depending on the region. It was something that we have discussed at great length when we've talked about the incorporation of green space and the categorization of green space into the climate risk and vulnerability assessment. Because the open access methodology that we had originally designed did not categorize agricultural land as a green space. So it's something that we have tried to pick up because we do acknowledge that there is some land as such around the West Midlands, outside the urbanized areas. So we have acknowledged this and we've tried to catch it by updating the way we capture green space by leveraging a few different data sets to make sure that it's considered. And I think if we were, and this is something we're thinking about later in the project in terms of layer integration, where we've currently got the methodology where we sum layers and then we multiply them across. Is that the right approach? Should we be combining all the layers to a CRVA as a single output, or should we perhaps be slicing and dicing some of the layers to represent different functions or categories of or areas of importance or variables of significance, or different ways we could address climate risk in a certain area? That is something that I think would be a way that could be incorporated, and it's ongoing discussion. And I think what's been really great about this co-development with the combined authority and with other stakeholders is that we have a lot of flexibility with how we pull the data together. We have started exploring some of the different ways of combining the data, and what you do tend to find is that you will still see the same overall areas that do come up with a general high risk, but it's just some of the nuance at the real detailed level that would change a little bit. So basically where I'm going with all of this is that there are lots of different ways we could find ways to address it. I think the methodology would allow for that to happen. We haven't directly addressed it in what we're doing on this project, but that's certainly scope to consider. So thank you for the great question.
It is, and it kind of all links back to how it's a tool for decision makers in the region. Agriculture is quite, a relatively small part of our land cover within the region, but it's not unimportant. And the other thing the climate risk and vulnerability assessment doesn't include for Birmingham is anything to do with the coast. So that's the other area of risk that's not considered in the approach that we've developed for the West Midlands. So I think we've addressed all questions. If anybody has a short 1 minute or even less minute question now, they could quickly fire it into the QA or the chat. But I think what would be the right thing to do now is thank Sarah and James and Marianne for speaking. Thank all of you for listening and for asking questions.